The alarm went off like a banshee, shrill and unforgiving, just as I was about to complete the most critical part of my experiment. Damn it. I'd spent weeks setting up these volcanic ash samples, and now this. Everyone out. This is not a drill. The security guard's voice boomed over the intercom. I stared at my lab table in dismay. 3 months of research, and the timing couldn't be worse. Frantically, I started grabbing my notebooks and hard drives, trying to salvage what I could. "Ma'am, you need to evacuate now." The guard appeared at my doorway, his face deadly serious. "Just give me 30 seconds, I pleaded, shoving equipment into my bag. Smoke was already curling under the door when I finally headed for the exit, my arms loaded with irreplaceable samples and data. The hallway was hazy, and the acrid smell burned my nostrils. The evacuation route sign flickered ominously above me as I stumbled forward, the weight of my equipment throwing me off balance. That's when one of my sample cases slipped, scattering labeled vials across the floor. "No, no, no!" I dropped to my knees, desperately gathering them up as the smoke thickened. "Here, let me help." A voice cut through my panic. Strong hands appeared beside mine, efficiently collecting the scattered vials. I looked up to see a woman with striking black hair and the most intense blue eyes I'd ever encountered. She moved with purpose, scooping up my samples with surprising care for a stranger. "Thanks," I managed between coughs. "I'm Elizabeth. These samples are your life's work, I'm guessing." She handed me the recovered vials. "Morgan. Now let's get out before we become samples ourselves." She took half my load without asking and guided me through the increasingly smoky corridor. Unlike everyone else who had scattered in panic, she seemed to know exactly where to go. When we reached a junction where the main exit was blocked, she didn't hesitate. "This way," she said, nodding toward a service corridor I hadn't even noticed. Alternative exit. Outside, the autumn air hit my lungs like a blessing. The research facility's staff huddled in groups across the parking lot, watching as fire trucks arrived with wailing sirens. I bent over, hands on my knees, gulping in fresh air. "Volcanic ash," Morgan said, examining one of my labeled containers. "You're the volcanologist they mentioned in the visitor center." I straightened up, suddenly aware of how disheveled I must look. "Dr. Elizabeth Gonzalez." "And you are?" "Morgan Anderson, Indigenous Guide Service. I was here for my certification renewal when all hell broke loose." She handed me back my container with a slight smile. "These local formations aren't exactly known for their volcanic activity. Every rock tells a story if you know how to listen." I found myself returning her smile, even dormant ones. Something about her steady gaze made my stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with our narrow escape. The fire chief announced the all clear, just a kitchen fire in the cafeteria, but I barely heard him. Morgan's presence commanded my attention in a way I couldn't explain. "Well, Dr. Gonzalez," she said, brushing ash from her sleeve, "seems like you've got good instincts for danger zones." "Elizabeth," I corrected her, and if that were true, I wouldn't have needed rescuing. "Sometimes even experts need a guide." Morgan handed me her card. "If you ever want to explore the real terrain instead of just samples." As she walked away, I realized my heart was beating faster than during the evacuation. I tucked her card into my pocket, certain our paths would cross again. The fire might have interrupted my experiment, but something else entirely had just been set in motion. 3 weeks after the fire alarm incident, I sat at my desk staring at the approval letter in disbelief. The Mobile Geological Survey had actually greenlit my proposal to study the dormant volcanic systems just outside the city. Funding, equipment, permits, everything I'd been fighting for over the past year had finally come through. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Anna remarked, leaning against my office doorframe. Dr. Howard had been my research partner for 5 years, her gray-streaked hair and permanent skepticism a constant in my academic life. "Better. Got the volcanic study approved." I waved the letter. "They're even providing a local guide with indigenous knowledge." Anna snorted. "Those dormant systems haven't burped in 10,000 years. What exactly are you hoping to find?" "Patterns, signatures. Things modern instruments might have missed." I didn't mention my theory about potential activity. Anna was brilliant but tended to dismiss anything that couldn't be quantified in a lab. My border collie, Ash, dozed under my desk, occasionally twitching in his sleep. I'd rescued him 3 years ago, and the research facility made an exception to their no pets policy after he proved himself surprisingly well behaved in laboratory settings. 2 days later, I arrived at the expedition office with equipment cases and a nervous energy I couldn't quite place. Ash trotted beside me, unusually alert for our typical workday. The project coordinator waved me toward a conference room. "Your guide's already here. Got all the paperwork sorted," he said. I pushed open the door and froze. Sitting at the table, reviewing topographical maps, was Morgan Anderson. She looked up, recognition immediately lighting her blue eyes. "Dr. Gonzalez," she said, standing. "Looks like fate doesn't need fire alarms this time." "Elizabeth," I reminded her, extending my hand, which she took, holding it perhaps a second longer than necessary. "I had no idea you were assigned to this project. I specialize in these volcanic formations. My grandmother's people have stories about them going back generations." She gestured to the maps. "Already marked some spots your equipment might miss." I tried to maintain professional composure, while my heart performed gymnastics in my chest. Morgan wore hiking boots and a fitted field shirt that highlighted her athletic build. Her black hair was pulled back in a practical braid, revealing high cheekbones that spoke of her indigenous heritage. "This is Ash," I said, partly to distract myself as my dog approached Morgan cautiously. Morgan knelt, offering her hand to Ash, who sniffed it thoroughly before giving it a tentative lick. "Good judge of character," she commented with a smile that made me inexplicably warm. We spent the next hour reviewing the expedition plan. I explained my research objectives while trying not to notice how Morgan's blue eyes tracked my movements with undisguised interest, or how her occasional questions showed remarkable insight for someone without formal geological training. "So we head out tomorrow?" she asked, gathering the maps. "Crack of dawn. I want to set up monitoring equipment at these 3 sites. I pointed to marked locations on the map, my finger accidentally brushing against hers. My professional resolve wavered as electricity seemed to spark between us. Morgan's expression shifted subtly, and I knew she felt it too. Before I could process this, Ash suddenly jerked to attention, growling at the window. "What's wrong, boy?" I knelt beside him, concerned. Ash never behaved this way. Morgan joined me, watching as Ash continued growling at seemingly nothing. "Animals sense things we can't," she said softly. "My grandmother always said to pay attention when they act strange near the old volcanic lands." "He's probably just smelling a squirrel," I offered, though Ash's behavior seemed genuinely unsettling. Morgan's eyes met mine, serious now, maybe. Or maybe there's something in those dormant systems worth listening to after all. As we left the building together, Ash staying unusually close to my side, I couldn't shake the feeling that this expedition was going to be far more than just professional research. Morgan's presence had already disrupted my carefully ordered world, and the mountains we were about to explore might hold disruptions of their own. The mountain air hit differently at dawn, sharper, more honest somehow. I adjusted my pack as Morgan led us up a narrow trail I would have missed entirely on my own. Ash bounded ahead, seemingly recovered from yesterday's strange behavior. "Your dog seems to know where he's going," Morgan commented, navigating around a boulder with graceful ease. "He's usually not this enthusiastic about fieldwork." I panted slightly, my academic lifestyle showing as I struggled to match her pace. "I'm usually dragging him away from squirrels." Morgan moved with a confidence born of intimacy with the land, each step deliberate yet effortless. I found myself watching her more than the terrain, the way sunlight caught the blue-black sheen of her hair, how her shoulders set themselves against the weight of her pack. "Up here," she called, pointing to a ridge that offered a perfect view of the valley system. "This spot has the best vantage point for your equipment setup." I knelt to unpack my seismic monitors. "How did you know this would be ideal? The satellite imagery didn't show this clearing." "My people have mapped these mountains for generations without satellites." There was no defensiveness in her voice, just simple fact. The stories tell which paths are steady, which might shift. As I calibrated my instruments, Morgan pointed out features of the landscape invisible to casual observation, subtle differences in vegetation that indicated underground thermal changes, rock formations that had shifted imperceptibly over decades. "You see that discoloration?" She gestured toward what looked like an ordinary cliff face. "My grandmother would say that's where the mountain breathes." "Possible gas emission point," I translated into scientific terms, though her phrasing held a poetry my terminology lacked. "That's not in any of the survey records." Morgan smiled. "Some things you have to be taught to see." By midday, we'd established 3 monitoring stations, and I'd filled half a notebook with observations that challenged existing geological surveys. Morgan's knowledge complemented my scientific approach in ways I hadn't anticipated. When she explained local phenomena using indigenous concepts, I found myself translating them into scientific hypotheses that actually made surprising sense. "You're not what I expected," I admitted as we shared trail mix on a sun-warmed rock. "A guide who knows her geology?" She raised an eyebrow. "Someone who bridges worlds so effortlessly." The words fell out before I could filter them. Her eyes met mine, serious for a moment. Bridges can be lonely places to stand. The atmosphere between us shifted, something unspoken yet palpable. Ash chose that moment to bark urgently, drawing our attention to darkening clouds rolling in from the west. "That wasn't in the forecast." I frowned, checking my weather app, which showed clear skies. Mountain weather makes its own rules. Morgan was already packing up. "There's a shelter about 20 minutes from here. We should move." The rain hit with stunning swiftness, transforming from sprinkles to sheets in minutes. We hurried along an increasingly slick trail, Ash staying close to my heels as thunder rumbled overhead. By the time Morgan led us into a small cave entrance, we were both drenched. "Didn't know autumn storms hit this hard here," I shivered, water dripping from my auburn hair. "Climate's changing, like everything else." Morgan shrugged off her pack and pulled out a small emergency kit, producing a thermal blanket. "Here." The cave was just large enough for the 2 of us to sit comfortably. Ash shook himself vigorously, then settled at the entrance, watching the rain with canine displeasure. "My grandmother would say this storm is a gift." Morgan's voice was soft as she wrapped the blanket around both our shoulders, the proximity sending an involuntary warmth through me that had nothing to do with the thermal material, the mountain choosing to show you its moods. "Your grandmother sounds wise." I found myself leaning slightly into her warmth. "Do you have many stories from her?" As rain drummed outside our shelter, Morgan shared tales of the mountains. How they had once been fire before becoming stone, how they still remembered their molten hearts. Her voice created a spell in our small sanctuary, and I found myself entranced not just by the stories but by the storyteller. When she reached up to adjust the blanket, her fingers brushed against my collarbone. The contact was brief, electric. We both froze, caught in a moment that suddenly felt inevitable. Her eyes met mine, questioning. My breath caught as she leaned fractionally closer, her hand still resting near my neck. The spell broke when Ash barked sharply, announcing the storm's retreat. I pulled back, pulse racing as if I'd been running instead of sitting perfectly still. "Looks like we can head back soon," I said, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. Morgan nodded, her expression carefully neutral as she stood and offered me her hand. "The mountain's given us enough excitement for one day." As I took her hand, I knew with unsettling certainty that the real tremors had nothing to do with the dormant volcano beneath our feet. Back at the research station 3 days later, I frowned at the seismic readings on my laptop. The numbers didn't make sense. According to our instruments, there was a subtle but consistent pattern of microtremors occurring beneath the northernmost monitoring site. Activity that shouldn't exist in a system dormant for millennia. "That can't be right," I muttered, cross-checking against historical data. I'd run the calibration twice already. Ash paced anxiously at my feet, whining and periodically barking at the wall. He'd been increasingly agitated since our return from the field, refusing to settle into his usual nap spot under my desk. "What's gotten into you?" I knelt beside him, checking for injuries or tics, anything that might explain his behavior. Nothing. When Morgan arrived with topographical maps for our next excursion, Ash immediately rushed to her, circling anxiously and nudging her hand. "Hey there," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Someone's worked up today." "He's been like this since yesterday," I admitted. "And these readings are equally unsettling." I gestured to my laptop. "I'm picking up activity that shouldn't be there." Morgan studied the screen, her expression thoughtful. "Which site is this from?" "Northern Ridge, the one you called Grandmother's Watch." Something flickered across her face. "That's where the old stories say the mountain speaks first when it's ready to wake." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "You think there's actually something happening down there?" "And I think your dog does." Morgan nodded toward Ash, who had resumed his agitated pacing. "Animals, no. The door swung open as Anna walked in, carrying a stack of reports. "Elizabeth, did you realign those sensors? The readings are showing anomalies." "They're calibrated correctly," I replied, gesturing to the verification data. "I think we might be detecting genuine seismic activity." Anna peered over her glasses at my screen, then laughed. "In a system that's been inactive for 10,000 years? More likely there's interference from logging operations 5 miles north." She glanced at Ash, who was now growling at nothing. "And what's wrong with your dog?" "He's been acting strange around the northern site data," Morgan offered. Anna's expression cooled noticeably. She'd made little effort to hide her skepticism about including what she called local folklore in our scientific expedition. "Dogs react to their owner's stress," Anna said dismissively. "You're seeing patterns where none exist, Elizabeth. Don't let alternative perspectives cloud your scientific judgment." The condescension in her tone made me bristle. "The instruments don't lie, Anna. Something's happening." "Mining activity, construction, or faulty equipment," Anna countered, dropping the reports on my desk. "I need these reviewed by tomorrow. The grant committee wants progress updates, not ghost stories." After she left, an uncomfortable silence settled between Morgan and me. "She doesn't mean to be dismissive," I said finally, though part of me wasn't sure that was true. "I'm used to it." Morgan's voice was even, but I could see the slight tightening around her eyes. "Science has been dismissing indigenous knowledge since contact." Later that evening, after everyone else had left, I found myself alone in the lab with Morgan, poring over expanded data sets. Ash had finally exhausted himself and lay sleeping, though still twitching occasionally. "Do you really think something's happening under there?" I asked, rubbing my tired eyes. Morgan was quiet for a moment. My grandmother would say the earth speaks in whispers before it shouts. Whether that's scientifically valid? She shrugged. The soft glow of the computer screens cast shadows across her face, highlighting her strong profile. The professional boundary I'd been maintaining felt increasingly fragile. "I was engaged once," I found myself saying, to another researcher. She couldn't understand why I'd waste my career studying dead volcanoes when active ones got all the funding and recognition. Morgan looked up, surprised by this personal revelation. "What happened?" "Said he took a position in Hawaii. Said I could join her or stay with my geological fossils. I stayed." I smiled ruefully, not my finest relationship moment. "Sounds like she didn't understand what drives you," Morgan said, her voice gentle. "Which is?" "The mystery, the quiet stories." Her eyes held mine. "Sometimes the most powerful forces wait silently for generations." The tension between us thickened, and I found myself wondering what it would be like to cross the invisible line we'd drawn. Before I could contemplate further, Ash suddenly jerked awake, barking frantically at the wall where our northern site data was projected. "Easy, boy," I soothed, checking the monitors. Nothing seemed amiss. Morgan knelt beside Ash, watching him carefully. "There's something he's trying to tell us." If only he could speak, I sighed, unconsciously stepping closer to her. "Maybe he is speaking," Morgan said quietly. "We're just not listening in the right language yet." As I looked between my agitated dog and the troubling data readings, I couldn't shake the feeling that both Morgan and Ash were tuned to frequencies my scientific instruments, and perhaps my rational mind, couldn't yet detect. Another week of fieldwork had left me more confused than ever. Our monitoring equipment kept malfunctioning at the northern site, batteries draining inexplicably, data corrupted, sensors misaligning despite careful setup. It was as if the mountain itself rejected our scientific intrusion. "This is the third time this week," I grumbled, removing yet another damaged sensor. "These are designed to withstand extreme conditions. It makes no sense." Morgan stood a few feet away, watching as Ash circled the perimeter of our research area, sniffing anxiously and refusing to cross an invisible line about 10 meters from our equipment. "He won't come any closer," she observed. "Hasn't for days now." I glanced at my normally adventurous dog. "I've noticed. It's like he's afraid of something. Or warning us about something." I'd started taking Morgan's observations more seriously, noting them alongside my scientific data. The strange convergence between Ash's behavior, our equipment failures, and the indigenous stories Morgan shared had become too consistent to dismiss. "There's a story," Morgan said carefully, knowing by now how I responded to her cultural knowledge, about certain places where the barrier between worlds grows thin. My grandmother called them breath spots, where the deeper earth exhales. Before I could respond, my satellite phone buzzed with a text from Anna. Committee visit tomorrow. Need you back at lab to prep presentation. I sighed. Duty calls. We'll have to finish this survey tomorrow. As we packed up, Morgan suddenly stiffened. Do you hear that? I listened, hearing only wind. What? Like a hum. Coming from below. I pulled out my handheld frequency detector, but it showed nothing unusual. Yet Morgan's expression was so focused, so certain, that I found myself believing her despite the lack of measurable data. The next morning at the lab, I buried myself in reports and presentations, while Anna hovered nearby, editing my findings to emphasize the more conservative interpretations of our data. The committee doesn't want to hear speculation, she insisted, deleting my notes about equipment malfunctions and Ash's behavior. Stick to what we can prove. Morgan had taken the day to guide another group, and I found myself missing her steady presence and insightful observations. Ash lay by the door, watching me with what almost seemed like disapproval. By late afternoon, with the committee meetings finally concluded, I decided to review our field photos. Something about the northern site kept nagging at me. Comparing images from our first visit with the most recent ones, I noticed subtle changes in rock coloration. Nothing dramatic, but definitely different. That shouldn't be possible in this time frame, I murmured. My phone rang. Morgan's name lighting up the screen. Elizabeth. Her voice was tight with urgency. Can you meet me at the North Trailhead? There's something you need to see. 40 minutes later, I pulled up to find Morgan waiting beside her truck, gear already packed. What's going on? I asked as Ash leapt from my vehicle, unusually alert. Remember that humming sound? I followed it. Found what looks like a new fissure about half a kilometer from our monitoring site. We hiked in charged silence, Morgan moving with purposeful strides while I struggled to keep up. When we reached a narrow ravine I didn't recognize, she stopped. Watch your step here. It wasn't like this last week. The ground had indeed shifted, creating a narrow crack about 6 inches wide. More alarming was the faint shimmer of heat rising from it, visible even in the late afternoon light. This is volcanic venting, I whispered, kneeling for a closer look. But that's impossible without precursor signs we would have detected. Unless something's blocking your instruments. Morgan knelt beside me, our shoulders touching, or they're not designed to detect what's actually happening. I pulled out my phone to document the fissure when the ground beneath us suddenly shifted. The narrow ledge where I was balanced crumbled, and I found myself sliding toward the widening crack. Elizabeth! Morgan lunged forward, catching my arm with surprising strength. For one terrifying moment, I dangled over the fissure, feeling heat rising from below. Then Morgan braced herself and pulled, dragging me back onto solid ground. We collapsed together, my body pressed against hers, both of us breathing hard. Are you okay? She asked, her face inches from mine, arms still holding me securely. Yes, I managed, acutely aware of every point where our bodies connected. Thank you. Neither of us moved. Her eyes searched mine, and I felt something crumble inside me, some wall of professional distance or personal fear. Without overthinking, I leaned forward and kissed her, my hand sliding into her hair. Morgan responded immediately, pulling me closer as the kiss deepened. All the tension of the past weeks transformed into something electric between us. When we finally broke apart, I felt dizzy from more than just the near fall. I've been wanting to do that since the fire alarm, I admitted, my voice shaky. Morgan smiled, her hand still resting at the small of my back. I know. Ash barked suddenly, breaking the moment. The ground beneath us gave another subtle shift. We should move, Morgan said, helping me up. This area isn't stable. As we carefully made our way back to safer ground, her hand remained firmly in mine. The mountain might be growing more dangerous, but at least I was no longer fighting my feelings along with the mysterious forces beneath our feet. The following days passed in a strange dance of avoidance. After our kiss at the fissure, I threw myself into work with renewed intensity, analyzing the new data and sending urgent requests for specialized equipment. My rational mind kept insisting that what happened between Morgan and me was a reaction to danger, adrenaline and proximity creating momentary attraction. My heart knew better, which is exactly why I kept myself surrounded by colleagues and equipment. You've been living in this lab, Anna remarked on the third day. Did something happen in the field? Just concerned about the new fissure activity, I replied. not meeting her eyes. Anna studied me for a moment. And your indigenous guide? She hasn't been around. Morgan's name is on the check-in sheet every morning, I said defensively. She's been mapping the terrain around the new vent. Without you? Anna raised an eyebrow. Thought you two were joined at the hip these days. I felt my cheeks warm. We're professionals working on different aspects of the same project. Anna didn't sound convinced, but she mercifully changed the subject. The committee wants daily updates now. This new development has them spooked but interested. After she left, I checked my phone. No messages from Morgan, though she'd left detailed field notes each day. Part of me felt relieved at the space between us. Another part ached with missing her steady presence and quiet insights. Ash hadn't been himself either. He'd taken to sleeping by the door instead of under my desk, as if waiting for someone who wasn't coming. You miss her too, huh? I whispered to him late that night as we were finally heading home. The next morning, my equipment detected a significant spike in subterranean gas emissions near our northern site. This wasn't just unusual, it was potentially dangerous. I immediately called Morgan's extension. Elizabeth. Her voice was formal, professional. I was about to call you. My contacts in the North Valley reported steam venting from a new location. We need to check it immediately, I said. The readings indicate elevated hydrogen sulfide levels. I'll meet you at the trailhead in 20 minutes. The drive to the mountain passed in tense silence. When we reached the access road, we found a park ranger blocking the path. Eye area's closed, he informed us. Unusual activity reported. I flashed my research credentials. That's why we're here. I'm Dr. Gonzalez, lead geologist on the Mobile Volcanic Survey. He hesitated, then stepped aside. Be careful up there. Something doesn't feel right. Morgan and I exchanged glances but said nothing. We both knew the mountains better than anyone by now. 2 miles up the trail, Ash began barking frantically, refusing to go further. The normally brave dog cowered, teeth bared at the path ahead. He's never acted like this, I said, concerned. Morgan knelt beside him. He knows something we don't. Before we could decide whether to continue, my equipment alarm blared. Gas levels had spiked dramatically. At the same moment, we heard a low rumble from deeper in the mountains. We need to implement emergency protocols, I said, already reaching for my satellite phone. These readings indicate an imminent hazardous gas release. Morgan nodded grimly. I'll alert the indigenous communities in the Northern Valley. They're closest to the danger zone. We worked rapidly, contacting authorities and initiating the evacuation plan we developed but never expected to use. Within an hour, sirens were wailing throughout the region as people began moving to designated safe zones. Anna's voice crackled over the satellite phone. Elizabeth, what the hell's happening? The committee's in panic mode. Clear the research facility, I ordered. Get everyone to the southern checkpoint. This isn't a drill. As the evacuation proceeded, Morgan and I coordinated from our position on the mountain, directing teams away from danger areas our research had identified. Hours passed in a blur of emergency calls and split-second decisions. When the immediate crisis response stabilized, we realized a new problem. The road back to the main evacuation route had been cut off by a small landslide, likely triggered by the subterranean activity. We're going to need to stay up here tonight, Morgan said, checking the satellite imagery on her tablet. Alternative route won't be safe until daylight. The research cabin maintained for field stays was our best option. As darkness fell, we made our way there through increasingly foggy conditions. Ash pressed nervously against my leg the entire way. Inside the small cabin, tension hung thick between us. Morgan busied herself checking supplies, while I established communication with the emergency command center. All vulnerable populations evacuated, I reported after ending the call. No casualties reported. They'll reassess in the morning. Morgan nodded, setting 2 mugs of tea on the small table. Your quick action saved lives today. Our quick action, I corrected, finally meeting her eyes directly for the first time since the kiss. I couldn't have done this without you. The silence between us shifted, became charged with everything unsaid. About what happened at the fissure, I began. You've been avoiding me, she said simply. I know, I'm sorry. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug. I'm not good at this, whatever this is. And what do you think this is? Morgan's blue eyes held mine steadily. Outside, the mountain rumbled again, as if emphasizing the question. Ash whined and scratched at the door, his behavior growing increasingly frantic. "This is someone who makes me question everything I thought I knew," I admitted, the words tumbling out as another tremor shook the cabin. "Someone who sees the world differently than I do, but somehow makes more sense of it than I ever could with all my instruments and theories." Morgan set down her mug and moved closer, perching on the edge of my chair. "And that scares you?" "Terrifies me," I whispered. "I built my career on measurable facts, on proving things. But you feel things I can't measure. And so does Ash. And I'm starting to think you're both right about this mountain." Her hand found mine, warm and steady. "Science and intuition aren't enemies, Elizabeth. They're just different languages describing the same world." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cabin's aging frame. Ash's frantic scratching had escalated to desperate barking. "He's really worked up," Morgan observed, squeezing my hand before releasing it to check on him. I followed, concerned by my dog's behavior. When Morgan opened the door slightly, Ash tried to push through, only stopped by her quick reflexes. "Whoa there," she said, blocking his exit. "It's not safe out." The rest of her sentence was lost as Ash barked louder, his entire body trembling with urgency. "I've never seen him like this," I said, kneeling beside him. "Something's really wrong." Morgan looked out into the darkness. "The air smells different, metallic." A shudder ran through me that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "Gas emissions. We should check the monitors." My laptop showed alarming spikes in multiple gas types, concentrated near our location. "This isn't good. The cabin's in a depression. Gases could accumulate here." Our eyes met, mutual understanding passing between us. We needed to move, despite the dangers of navigating the mountain at night. "We could try for the ridge overlook," Morgan suggested, already gathering essential supplies. "It's higher ground, away from potential gas pockets." As we hastily packed emergency gear, another tremor shook the cabin, stronger this time. A ceiling beam groaned ominously. "Time to go," Morgan said, shouldering her pack. With Ash leading the way, we stepped into darkness broken only by our flashlights. The familiar trail seemed alien at night, transformed by shadows and the constant subtle vibrations beneath our feet. Morgan moved with confidence despite the conditions, occasionally reaching back to guide me over rough terrain. "The ridge should be just ahead," she called back after 20 minutes of careful hiking. My response died in my throat as I felt her suddenly freeze. Following her gaze, I saw what had stopped her. A massive fallen tree blocking our path, freshly uprooted by the shifting ground. "There's no way around," I said, playing my light across the obstacle. "The slope's too steep on both sides." Ash whined, pacing nervously before the barrier. Morgan studied it thoughtfully. "We could try climbing over," she suggested. "The trunk seems stable." I nodded, following her lead as she found handholds and carefully pulled herself up onto the massive trunk. Once atop the fallen giant, she reached back for me. Our hands clasped, and she pulled me up beside her with surprising strength. For a moment we stood there, suspended above the forest floor, her arms steadying me as I caught my balance. The intimacy of the moment hit me suddenly, her body close to mine, her face dimly illuminated by moonlight filtering through the canopy. "What about Ash?" I asked, breaking the spell. Morgan whistled softly, and to my amazement, Ash found a gap beneath the tree's root system, squeezing through to the other side. "Smart dog," she smiled. "He knows his way." We made it to the ridge as the eastern sky began showing the first faint signs of dawn. Exhausted, we set up our emergency shelter, a small tent hardly big enough for two. Ash immediately flopped down at the entrance, his vigilance finally giving way to exhaustion. Inside the tent, we sat facing each other, both too wired from our night journey to sleep despite our fatigue. Morgan pulled out her satellite phone, checking for updates. "All evacuees accounted for," she reported. "Rescue teams will start searching for us at first light." Relief washed through me, followed by a different kind of tension as I became acutely aware of our proximity in the small space. Morgan must have felt it too. Her eyes held mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "I think we've both been running from this long enough," she said softly, moving closer until her knees touched mine. "From what?" My voice was barely audible. "From this." She reached up, her fingers tracing along my jawline before tangling in my hair. This time when our lips met, there was no fear, no mountain crumbling beneath us, just the gentle certainty of something that had been inevitable since that first day, amid fire alarms and smoke. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer as years of scientific restraint melted away beneath her touch. Her fingers worked deftly at my collar, each button coming undone with deliberate care. I gasped as her lips traveled down my neck, every point of contact sending tremors through me more profound than anything the mountain had produced. "I've wanted this since I first saw you," she whispered against my skin. Clutching those precious samples, refusing to leave without them. My hands found their way under her shirt, tracing the warm skin beneath. "I never believed in things I couldn't measure," I breathed as she lowered me gently onto our makeshift bedding. "Until I met you." Outside our tent, the world might be in chaos, but within this small space, we created our own perfect order. Bodies finding natural harmony, whispered discoveries and soft moans forming a language more primal than either science or tradition could capture. Dawn broke fully as we lay entwined, breathing synchronized, her head resting on my shoulder. Ash's urgent scratching at the tent flap jolted us back to reality. "I think our guardian has decided break time's over," Morgan smiled against my skin. As if confirming her words, the ground beneath us gave another ominous rumble. Morgan was dressed and outside the tent before I'd even found my shirt. Ash's urgent barking had us both moving with renewed purpose, the intimacy of moments before replaced by professional focus, though the occasional glance between us carried new depth. "The ridge doesn't feel stable," Morgan observed as another tremor rippled beneath our feet. "We need to move toward the evacuation point." I checked the satellite phone's GPS. "That's nearly 5 miles, across some pretty treacherous terrain." "I know a way," she said confidently. "Not on any official maps, but my grandmother showed me years ago. It'll cut the distance by almost half." I didn't hesitate. "Lead on." The path Morgan chose would never have appeared viable to me. Narrow game trails connecting seemingly impassable sections, traditional route markers visible only to those who knew what to look for. We moved as quickly as safety allowed, Ash scouting ahead while Morgan guided me across unstable ground. "Give me your hand here," she'd say, particularly tricky sections, her grip strong and reassuring. Each touch now carried the memory of Dawn's intimacy, though neither of us had time to dwell on it. 3 miles in, we crested a rise and spotted the main evacuation camp in the valley below. Emergency vehicles and tents scattered across what would normally be a picturesque meadow. "Almost there," I said with relief. A sudden, violent tremor nearly knocked us off our feet. As the ground stabilized, a terrifying sound reached us, Ash's panicked yelp, followed by silence. "Ash!" I called, spinning around to find him gone from the trail behind us. "There." Morgan pointed to a depression several yards off the path where debris had collected. Among fallen branches and disturbed earth, I spotted a patch of black and white fur, unnaturally still. I ran without thinking, Morgan calling after me to be careful. The ground felt dangerously soft underfoot, but nothing mattered except reaching Ash. When I got to him, I found him partially buried by fallen rock and soil, whimpering softly. "It's okay, boy," I soothed, dropping to my knees beside him. "I'm here." Morgan arrived seconds later, already assessing the situation with remarkable calm. "We need to move carefully. This whole area could collapse further." Together we began clearing debris, working to free Ash without causing him further injury. He whimpered when we touched his hind leg, which was pinned under a heavy branch. "I think it's broken," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. Morgan nodded grimly. "We need to stabilize it before moving him." Using first aid supplies from our packs, we managed to fashion a makeshift splint. All the while, I kept talking to Ash, my hands trembling as I worked. "You're going to be fine," I promised him, though tears threatened. "Just hang on." Once the splint was secure, we faced the challenge of moving him. At 60 pounds, Ash was too heavy for either of us to carry alone across unstable terrain. "We can make a sling," Morgan suggested, already removing her outer shirt. "Use it to distribute his weight between us." The ground rumbled again as we worked, more insistent this time. Small pebbles cascaded down from the ridge above us. "We need to hurry," I said, eyeing the unstable slope. With Morgan's ingenuity and my determination, we crafted a functional carrier using our shirts and some climbing rope from our packs. Carefully, we eased Ash onto it, his trusting eyes never leaving my face despite his pain. "Ready?" Morgan asked, positioning herself at the front of our makeshift stretcher. I nodded, taking my position at the rear. Ready? Each step required perfect coordination, our bodies finding natural rhythm as we navigated the treacherous path. My arms burned with the effort, but I refused to stop or slow our pace. Ash remained surprisingly still, as if understanding the precariousness of our situation. We'd covered perhaps a quarter mile when a massive crack split the air. Looking back, I watched in horror as the entire section where Ash had been trapped collapsed, creating a chasm where we'd stood just 20 minutes before. Keep moving, Morgan urged, her voice tight with urgency. That whole ridge system is failing. The miles blurred together in a haze of exertion and fear. When we finally spotted the first emergency responders heading toward us, relief made my knees buckle. We need a veterinarian, I called out as they approached. My dog's injured. The next hours passed in controlled chaos. Medical teams assessed us while animal rescue specialists took charge of Ash, whisking him away to a mobile veterinary unit. Morgan stayed resolutely by my side through it all, her hand finding mine when the vet finally emerged with news. Clean break, the vet reported. He'll need surgery, but his prognosis is excellent. You did a good job with that field splint. In the command tent, we found Anna coordinating with emergency services, maps spread across makeshift tables. When she saw us, her usually composed face showed genuine relief. Elizabeth, thank God. She hurried over, then stopped short, noting our joined hands and disheveled appearance. You're both all right? We are, I confirmed, refusing to release Morgan's hand despite Anna's questioning gaze. And the evacuation? Completely successful, Anna reported. Your early warning system gave everyone enough time. As Anna briefed us on the situation, I felt Morgan's presence beside me like an anchor. When Anna explained that the northern ridge had partially collapsed, exactly as Morgan's grandmother's stories had predicted, I turned and kissed Morgan deeply, unconcerned about my colleague's startled expression or the roomful of emergency personnel. When we finally broke apart, I smiled at Morgan's surprised face. That's for being right about the mountain. Her answering smile was radiant, and here I thought science didn't believe in traditional knowledge. This scientist is learning to believe in many things, I replied, holding her gaze as the mountain rumbled its distant approval. 6 months after the mountain's awakening, I stood at the window of my new office, watching autumn leaves swirl across the university courtyard. The prestigious Journal of Volcanology had just published my paper on the mobile volcanic event, complete with a special section crediting indigenous knowledge systems in predicting seismic activity. On my desk sat an offer letter from the National Geological Survey, a director position with twice my current salary. Your desk is ringing, Morgan called from the doorway, Ash trotting beside her, his limp barely noticeable now. I smiled, letting the call go to voicemail. Let them wait. The events had transformed both our professional lives. Morgan had become the center of a movement integrating traditional knowledge into scientific research, while my early warning system had been lauded as revolutionary. But the greatest transformation had been personal. You're going to accept it, aren't you? Morgan asked, nodding toward the offer letter as she crossed the room to join me. I haven't decided, I replied honestly. It would mean relocating to Washington. We both knew what remained unspoken. What would it mean for us? For this relationship we'd built amid crisis and afterwards nurtured with deliberate care? Morgan turned to face the window, her profile outlined in autumn light. I got an offer too. The Indigenous Knowledge Foundation wants me to lead their environmental science initiative. Morgan, that's amazing. I reached for her hand. Where would you be based? That's the thing, she said, turning to face me fully. They're establishing their headquarters here in Mobile, something about the recent events making it the perfect case study for their work. Understanding dawned. So you'd be staying here, while I'd be in Washington. Unless... She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Unless we decided where to be together. My breath caught as she opened it, revealing a ring carved from volcanic stone, inlaid with turquoise. From the northern ridge, she explained softly. My grandmother helped me choose it. The stone remembers, she says. Remembers what? I whispered, heart pounding. That some forces, once awakened, never truly go dormant again. Morgan took my hand. I'm not asking you to choose between your career and me. I'm asking if we can figure out how to build something together, wherever that takes us. Ash nudged my leg, his approval clear. I laughed through sudden tears. I've spent my life studying things that stay buried for thousands of years before making themselves known, I said, touching the ring. I don't want us to be like that. I don't want to wait. When she slipped the ring onto my finger, it felt like the completion of a circle begun that chaotic day amid fire alarms and dropped samples. 2 weeks later, I stood before the National Geological Survey Director, explaining my counter-proposal, a joint research initiative between NGS and the Indigenous Knowledge Foundation, based in Mobile but with satellite operations in Washington. A true bridge between worlds, just as Morgan and I had become. Ambitious, the director commented, reviewing my proposal. But after your predictive success with the Mobile event, I'm inclined to support innovation. That evening, Morgan and I sat on the porch of the small cottage we'd purchased overlooking the mountains. Ash dozed between us as we reviewed property listings for our planned research center. What about this one? Morgan pointed to a former ranger station near the edge of the affected zone. Perfect location for monitoring, I agreed, and close enough to visit your grandmother regularly. As the sun set behind the mountains that had brought us together, I leaned into her embrace. Her lips found mine in a kiss that still carried the same electricity as our first. The committee approved our joint curriculum, I murmured against her mouth. First classes start next semester. She smiled. Professor Gonzalez Anderson. Has a nice ring to it. Almost as nice as Dr. and Mrs. Gonzalez Anderson, I replied, admiring how the volcanic stone caught the fading light. Later that night, as Morgan slept beside me, I found myself thinking about measurements and predictions, how my scientific life had been built around quantifying the predictable, until Morgan had taught me to listen to the whispers beneath the data. Her arm tightened around my waist, as if sensing my thoughts even in sleep. Outside our window, the mountains stood silent, their secrets shared now between science and story, just as our lives had become an unexpected fusion of different ways of knowing. Some would call what happened between us a simple chemical reaction, proximity and danger creating the illusion of connection. But as Morgan stirred beside me, murmuring my name in her sleep, I knew better. Some forces in nature cannot be reduced to mere formulas. They can only be experienced, honored, and cherished for the mysteries they remain. And in that space between knowing and mystery, we had found our home,